SportsLit is co-founded and co-hosted by Neil Acharya and Nate Sager. Technical producer and engineer, Michael Ella. Executive producer, Neil Acharya.
Bienvenue, welcome, and welcome to SportsLit. I am Nathan Sager. Mary Ormsby is here on this episode to discuss her book, World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson, which Sutherland House released on April 16th, 2024. Mary Ormsby, in her description, views the one-time hottest rivalry in track and field as a cold case, worth revisiting. Now, for many Canadians, it's kind of over and done with. They just need to hear the people, places, things to be put right back there. Ben Johnson of Canada, Carl Lewis of the United States, the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the men's 100-meter run, and last but not leastly, Stanozolol. Ormsby's World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson, recently released by Sutherland House. It covers the bedlam, but it also covers the man who came through it with his good heart and sense of humor intact. If you were not around back then to witness it firsthand, well, Ben Johnson was, per the CBC, the ultimate running machine. Right when the Olympics were admitting, yeah, we're a business, and okay, the athletes should be able to make some money off their talent. So let's remove the stone of amateurism, and I guess we'll attach the stone of steroid shaming. Johnson's talent, his drive, and his relationship with Coach Charlie Francis got him to the top. He had the same model Ferrari that Sonny Crockett, fictional character, had in Miami Vice, and this was all good until '88, when he became the first track and field Olympian to lose his gold medal for doping. Now, is it possible to be quote-unquote dirty and be done dirtily? Yes. It's this thing called due process, as Ormsby has outlined. I heard Ormsby outline in other interviews. Johnson's positive drug test and the disqualification that gave Carl Lewis the gold medal, it was all sort of taken on face value at the time. I think no one wondered why Canada, in hockey parlance, hurtled. Instead of lawyering up in Seoul, back home, everything shifted to what Ormsby calls, quote, an unprecedented media attack on an amateur athlete. Trigger words and racialized tropes rolled off keyboards and out of microphones with alarming ease, unquote. And I'm sitting back there in Bath, Ontario, taking this all in as an 11-year-old. And some of those tropes, I mean, they were just coming from the people angling to get on Team Ben and shape the story to their own ends. Now, as a Toronto Star reporter, Ormsby was in the stadium for that Johnson-Lewis showdown. In that era, she went to Europe to see how Ben Johnson got rock star treatment on the European track and field circuit. She covered the Dublin Inquiry, which was the Royal Commission in Canada that examined the use of performance-enhancing drugs in high-performance sports. Briefly, just some background on our guest. Mary Ormsby had a 3-decade-plus career as a feature writer and editor with the Toronto Star, the largest legacy newspaper in Canada. After she retired in 2020, she got to work on this book. Ormsby sort of blends an athlete's background and an athlete's understanding of how sports work with writerly skills. She's actually in Ohio State's Hall of Fame for her 4 seasons as a volleyball player there, all Big Ten selections. She was a co-captain of the team. And, you know, when people have played a sport, they understand all the little things that go into it. And perhaps they understand the narratives that are often unwritten by, you know, people who just, you know, came to it because they're writers who happen to like sports. And it's those details that make the long-form stories. I think, you know, in some ways, sprinters and long-form journalists are a little similar. They both have this craft that involves continually tiny adjustments, and most of those take place in a public view. Now, I grew up reading Mary Ormsby in the Star and hearing her chime in on primetime sports roundtables led by the great Bob McCowan. So around 2018, in the Star, 3 decades after Seoul, she published a big investigative report that reminded Canadians of what we did not know and did not hear 3 decades earlier about the urine tests administered on Ben Johnson. Now, Canadians, I think we can be very institutionalist. As I said, we took it on face. The IOC said Ben Johnson was guilty. Well, yeah, he was. Mainstream retellings of it and retrospectives, at least to me, I think they often didn't get into all the nitty gritty. They just sort of would go off into the rails of moralizing or emotive languaging without remembering, Ben Johnson is out the center of this. Now that I've read the book, give Mary Ormsby all the flowers for correcting the record for Canadians and sports fans who read. She puts it out there that Ben Johnson and Coach Charlie Francis, they did what it took to win. The risk reward in those days meant a dosage of steroids. I happen to have a copy of Francis's 1990 book, Speed Trap. He was scathing about the rot in the Canadian sports system when he competed in the early 70s and then when he went into coaching. Now, with any Olympic team program in a winner-take-all world, where's the proof? It's on the podium. And at the 1976 Montreal Olympics, held about 3 months after, a 14-year-old Ben Johnson had settled in the Toronto area with his mom, Gloria, and his siblings. Well, Canada became the first host nation that failed to win a gold medal. So, yeah, that's some, fearless feedback that you need to step up your game. Francis, started to get going in his coaching, and his runners started, including Ben, they started to get results. Before, better funding came along in the early 1980s, they faced, some pushback from the establishment. Francis wrote his book about having scarce support for his proteges, all black runners such as Johnson, Angela Taylor-Zajenko, Mark McCoy, the late Desai Williams, all children of Caribbean diasporas. Francis had these radical for their time techniques. He's working with black athletes, and people are denying, the success that he's had. And then suddenly, all of a sudden Canada realized, well, we actually want to be good here. The funding starts to come along, the sponsorship money pours in, and it's all good. And then Ben got caught. Now, until Sol Ormsby reminds us, Johnson was Canada's fast action hero, sort of, I guess, in the age of Schwarzenegger and Stallone action movies. The way he flew off the blocks was faster than anyone had ever measured. People couldn't believe how quickly he came off the blocks when the starter's pistol went off to start the race. And you don't get a start like that solely from drugs. Now, as I mentioned, I kind of wanted to leave out, where was I in all this? Because, like I said, I was a kid in grade 6. What I just remember was being kind of frightened and a little cold and confused by the way adults reacted. It all seemed very kind of one-sided and two-faced and manipulated, because you were all on Team Ben last week, and now you're all against him. To a child who was taught to not be judgmental, to treat people as they want to be treated, and don't believe everything you read. Just the sudden willingness to believe the worst about Ben Johnson, a black athlete in a country that was diversifying. It was alarming. And then there was the defense strategy that got cooked up. Someone with Johnson, you have to be smart to be an athlete, right? You have to have some smarts to understand what it takes to win. He had this razor sharp competitive awareness, and yet people are trying to say, well, he's just, he's this dupe with a childlike intellect. And I was like, that was the dog that was sent out to hunt. As David Giddens recently put in an article on CBC Sports about this book, World's Fastest Man, they, quote, orchestrated the public line that made Johnson out to be a clueless pawn in Charlie Francis's hands. Well, yes and no. But that's sort of, that whole episode sort of put me on my hill to die on vis-a-vis steroids. It definitely came in handy later because Barry Bonds was my favorite baseball player. Sol triggered what Charles P. Pierce, a sports writer favorite of mine, who was also in the stadium that day, as Mary Ormsby was, he's called it moralistic flotsam and authoritarian jetsam of the absurd anti-some drugs, but not others, crusade. Now, that's not to contend you could ever just have it all be out in the open. Watch the documentary Screwball and Icarus, and you'll be filled in on who's running the steroid trade. So I don't know if there's any squaring that circle. So we beat on. It's only cheating if you get caught, and you'll probably see a doping story in your feeds every day from here to the start of Paris 2024. Anyway, Ormsby's reporting and writing sort of adds color to those, gray shaded truths. In '88, it was all about the cheater. But what about the catchers? Ormsby highlights that Olympic drug testing in 1988 was in-house by the IOC. So To coin a phrase, those who paid the P tester could call the tune if they wanted. No, what's the incentive there? Is it to have clean sport, or is it just to catch one person? Another reason for citing Ben Johnson, it sort of goes back to therapy terms. I've learned in adulthood. I guess as a kid, I just didn't feel right about seeing the adults whom you were told to look up to be just binary and full of hot thoughts, instead of the sober second thought. And that kind of was extended to some teachers, some coaches, other parents you heard talking about it at the hockey rink, journalists in the newspaper, the OPP officer who came to my grade 6 class for the drug education talk. We just thought, me and my fellow Bath boys, wasn't everyone kind of doing this? And we, of course, you don't want to be that flippant about it with adults. But the logic of the elementary school playground and the minor hockey dressing room when the coach wasn't in the room was confirmed. 6 out of the 8 finalists in that Olympic men's 100 from '88, including Carl Lewis, did get implicated in doping somehow or some way. But of course, by the time it came out with Lewis, he and Johnson were long since retired from competing, and the flame had gone out. Sunshine, people forget, right? Now, if any good came from the whole saga, the Dublin inquiry that Mary covered, it was catalytic for international sports, dropping the fiction that it could catch athletes by testing at competitions only. Now, of course, you could still find plenty of well-founded skepticism about whether out of competition is testing everyone. It also took 7 Olympic quadrennials after Seoul, that's 28 years, before a third-party agency was finally created for testing. So now there is support for the professional growth of a field of experts who can catch the frauds. But this book reminds us, of course, Ben Johnson was not a fraud. He did live outside the law, and he wasn't always honest about it, but he was legit. And that narrative has picked up steam in the last, maybe 10, 15 years. There is a Team Ben again. Daniel Gordon's ESPN 30 for 30 doc 979 was influential. If you've seen it, Johnson came off pretty well. Carl Lewis just came off as a sore winner. The film, he also has this juxtaposition of a doctor saying, quote, athletes who are wearing braces in their adult years are almost certainly doping. And a few minutes later, the 80s footage shows Carl Lewis with, and this is not my phrase, tinsel teeth. And, that's part of, I think, why Mary Ormsby got to digging. Now, we've covered, obviously, the Afro-Caribbean Canadian diaspora sort of in episodes with Donovan Bailey, Dwayne De Rosario, Perdita Felicienne, touched on it a little with Morgan Campbell, Felicienne's spouse, and his former Toronto Star colleague. It all ties together. Ormsby in this book doesn't just show what happened in sort of the whodunit kind of way, but also shows Ben Johnson in full. And I think that pairs well with the Donovan Bailey autobiography we covered last fall. They were always linked together because of their nationality and because their background and their event, but they had such differing versions into Canadian life. And it's important to remember, no 2 diaspora stories are ever going to be alike, and one's personality and their outlook on the world, you can build that or condition it, just like a muscle or a tendon. Now, as a reminder, visit sportslit.ca for our entire catalog of episodes and links to buy the books. Coming up, Mary Ormsby discusses World's Fastest Man, the incredible life of Ben Johnson. Mary Ormsby, welcome to SportsLit and your book about Ben Johnson, as I've already discussed in the intro. So besides the knowledge and the firsthand experience with this story, I guess what else stirred your curiosity to reopen this as a cold case? I think starting in the Toronto Star around 2018.
It was probably talking to Ben over the decades, and he was actually pretty gracious about things, especially after he'd been treated rather poorly by the media, right after Seoul. But we would connect on things like the 10th anniversary of Seoul or the 15th and the 20th. So we started talking more about what happened around the test. And I said a couple of times, did you keep your test at all from Seoul? I've never really seen a doping test. And he couldn't find it. And I tried to find it through other lawyers and all that. And when I finally remembered it was an exhibit at the Dublin inquiry, I went, oh, well, I'll try to, get it through library and archives up in Ottawa-Gatineau area. And that was really the start of something that was a little more meaty, began looking at this test, I got a copy of it and saw there were a lot of handwritten alterations and scratch outs over an athlete's code and things that probably could have been questions in Seoul if the Canadian team defending Seoul at the time chose to look at the evidence, which we found out they didn't. So that is really what got me on the path to wondering, do we miss anything the first time around in Seoul? Should we have looked a little harder at what happened in that hearing? Did he get a fair hearing? Despite him later on, testifying that, yes, he did use steroids. But at the time in Seoul, when it was so critical to defend him, what kind of due process was he actually afforded? So that was kind of what got me interested in digging into more of the story. And Ben became more interested in it as well, as opposed to just answering my questions for stories in a newspaper. He said, do you think maybe there's a book in this down the road? And I said no for a long time because I was busy and I had 4 kids, and I just didn't think I could do it. I had never written a book before, but eventually, when I retired from the Star in 2020, we decided that we could do this. But at the root of it all, I really felt there was an injustice, and I thought, well, how close can we get to learning more of a truth about what happened to Ben in Seoul?
Yeah, and what sort of started to go, what did you sort of jump down at you when you finally did get your sort of hands on the drug test and start to scan through it? And I'm sure it's written in all this institutional type of jargon, but what sort of pieces started to come together as you started to examine it?
Well, part of that questioning was that Ben didn't attend his own hearing in Seoul. And even that was a question. I said, well, why weren't you there? And he said, well, I was told not to be in attendance. And the Canadian defense sort of led by Richard Pound, who was from Montreal and an IOC vice president at the time, and a very powerful guy. He said the collective Canadian mind thought it wasn't a good idea to have him there. So I thought, well, okay, that's odd. But that's how it happened. And then when Richard Pound said, well, we chose not to look at the science, we just accepted it as fact and infallible and unassailable. So we just didn't bother to even look at it. So that was a thing that really twigged something that was, procedural fairness was becoming an issue. And then we realized that the Canadians had not really fought back against a secondary test that was used against Ben. And he was really singled out yet again. And this was a test that showed that he was a long time doper, which was mind-blowing news at the time. But this test had not been disclosed to the Canadians before the hearing. They had no chance to get an expert to, push back or challenge any of that science. But the Canadians didn't, raise a peep about it. So there was all these things that, it came down to due process. And, as an athlete, he had a right to a fair hearing and all the robust defense you could possibly have. And on top of that, I'll just say, too, that you really question the impartiality of the hearing panel. So there would be IOC medical commission members. And these are the same folks who designed the drug tests to be used in Seoul. I mean, they're all smart people, but they were doing the testing, they were overseeing the testing, they were the prosecutors, they were the judge and the jury, all bound into this hearing that was going to determine whether Ben was going to keep his gold medal or not. So there was there was a bias right there. So all these things so jumped out at me as I thought, why didn't we ask more about this in 1988 or 89, like when the Dublin inquiry got rolling? So all this to say that I just thought, I just can't believe this is some sort of historic injustice that has not ever really been addressed. So let's address it.
Yeah. And to that point about the medical testing, like the testing then, now it's all done. There's a third party and there's a chance to, support, the group expertise that will catch, the dopers. But at that point, it's all in-house. So how does that, change the incentives to have a clean sport vis-a-vis, well, we just need to have that, one we can, put on the wall as Mr. Bad example.
Yeah. Well, it was compared to today, even though athletes are still failing tests today, it was a very primitive system in many ways. And as you mentioned, like the in-house science, their work wasn't really peer-reviewed or scrutinized outside of their own little, ecosystem of drug dopers. There weren't a lot of people doing that work back then. So they were a very small group of people who had a lot of power over athletes and not just their careers, but their lives, as it turns out in a case like Ben Johnson, when you can really stomp on a guy and ruin things for him. But I always have to say too, this is quite separate. When you support someone's right to due process, it doesn't necessarily mean you're endorsing their behavior about breaking rules. They're quite separate arguments. And I need to be very clear about that because, I don't think you should cheat, if those are the rules. But you're definitely, as a Canadian and as an athlete, Ben should have had more protections in place at the time. Maybe even if he had everything in place and had, they'd exhausted all options to defend him and pulled every trick in the book. At the end of the day, if he'd still, if the result still stood, he's failed a drug test, well, then you can accept that. But he didn't get any of that. Well, he didn't get most of that. So that's where I really sort of focus on the book, as that due process. Might things have been different had he been able to hold on to his gold medal? Then we have a different sort of discussion about his life going forward.
And how important is it just to have a record of again, something that illustrates that, hey, if you don't have due process, then there isn't any law, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's like when you're looking at something that might be a historic injustice and an ongoing historic injustice, I don't know how you can support a sports justice system that suspects or knows this exists and you do nothing to investigate it or kick the tires to see, did we do something wrong back then? Can we make it right now? So, and with what's going on right now with, the new agency that's come into play in sport, the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, they are now under fire for how they dealt with tainted drug tests of Chinese swimmers before the 2021 Olympics, and now they are in the bullseye of American anti-doping officials. So there's all this infighting that's happening, and sometimes I just wonder if, have we made any progress? I'm just not sure. I mean, there does seem to be justice for some, or benefit of the doubt for some, and not so much for other people.
Yeah, and that's something that really gets. And now with Ben Johnson, I mean, and him, you mentioned, of course, Ben's graciousness in being the subject for this book, and I'm sure Ben supplied a lot of stories about what it was like when he was, at his peak. Why do you think he was, so eager to have a book done? And also, I guess a second part to that, how fair is it to say that he's kind of found a grace where he realizes why he's notorious, but being notorious doesn't have him, so to speak? It sounds like I'm in a therapist's office a bit.
I think that he, his life has a duality to it. He's a very resilient guy. He's been able to scramble and make a living for himself. Even though he was banned from sport, banned from track and field, excuse me. He's a personal trainer, and he's been able to, cash in on his name and his appeal in different countries. He has gone to Tokyo many times to do reality shows. They love him over there in Japan, and he gets paid for those sorts of appearances. But that resilience, sort of is in balance with this bitterness and resentment of what happened in Seoul, how he felt that he was singled out. Yes, he was using anabolic steroids. Yes, he was breaking the rules, but he was not the only one. And his, he holds this very close to him, saying that most of his rivals at the time, that generation of sprinters in the 80s, were using something to help them. But because testing was so, willy-nilly at the time, you really only tested on race days in the 80s. There was no random testing, really. But he was, unfairly singled out in Seoul and was used as, like a bit of a trophy catch to say, the war on doping is now over. We've, taken down our biggest star in the system. and the rest of you be warned, never dope again, and we're going to catch you all. And of course, that's just nonsense, because it just never stopped.
Yeah, I think I've sort of just a nerd myself. Okay, I'm probably going to see a doping story on my timelines every day from here till the start of Paris 2024, which I think is 13, 14 weeks away. When you're looking back at that era, I remember doing a little essay on this one time and digging out a Fifth Estate. I think it was a CBC National report that Bob McEwen did, great investigative journalist, and someone who played pro football in the 70s. And he refers to Ben as the ultimate running machine. What does that phrase connote when you think back to that time, Mary?
Well, I know one of his teammates, Tony Sharp, who won a bronze medal at the '84 Olympics of the relay team with Canada and Ben. He said that Ben was called RoboCop as a runner. And I would say it's not just because of the steroids. Ben, did develop like a pretty, singular physique that really stood out. But I mean, they're all full of muscles. They're Olympians. But Ben, I think, was a highly coachable person. Whatever his coach, Charlie Francis, whatever the plan was, he drew up for him, Ben would follow it exactly. He didn't stray from anything. He would do exactly what Charlie said. So I think part of that idea as a running machine, not just was to do with his physical appearance and his ability to execute sprints at the highest level, but that he was incredibly focused. And Charlie even said he had a bit of a mystique about him. Like he had this uncanny ability to meditate and think about how fast he was running to the 10th of a second, or what he needed to run in heats and all that. So he was kind of like the total package as opposed to a running machine solely, but he was able to just put it all together, which, I mean, he was world champion at one point and obviously Olympic champion for 3 days. So, yeah.
And just to remind people who haven't known the stats, Ben was simultaneously the 60-meter indoor record holder and the 100-meter record 100-meter outdoor record holder in 1987, and that's exceptionally rare for someone to peak and take the world record in both track and field seasons, I think.
Well, you're right, because quite often, the 60 meters, as you would expect, the guy's got the greatest start can hold on to that for 60 meters. It's another thing to keep all that speed and endurance and maybe accelerate to over 100 meters and still hold that kind of, world dominance. And that was something that Ben could do. And that's a great point. That's what made him extraordinary. And Carl Lewis to some degree too. I mean, you got to give Carl Lewis, his rival, some props for this too. But Ben was undisputed fastest man in the world, 87, and for a good chunk of 88.
And of course, when we're thinking about the principal figures in the story, I think it is probably Ben Johnson and Charlie Francis. But our country, the nation of Canada, is their motivation factors in. Now, I wasn't around. Now, Ben Johnson, I think Gloria Johnson moved Ben and his siblings to Toronto in 1976. A few months later, Canada hosts the Olympics for the first time and becomes the first host nation to fail to win a gold medal. I think the transitive gold was Greg Joy's high jump silver. I made sure not to mention that to him when I interviewed him, or that my mom was expecting me at the time. But what did that do for maybe saying, okay, we've got to step up our game, and we maybe won't always ask questions about how it's being done?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because Canada as a nation was embarrassed by not winning a gold medal at their own games. And Charlie Francis it is quite interesting how Charlie Francis and how Ben Johnson absorbed those games, because Charlie wrote about it in his own book, that it was embarrassing, and they didn't put enough, as a country, enough coaching, money, effort, training camps, track and field anyway, to get sprinters to where they needed to be. And it was pretty obvious that some parts of the world, like the East Germans, were obviously doping, but not getting caught. And it was just impossible to try to keep up if you're trying to be, goody two-shoes Canadians and trying to get there on, just on, reindeer milk and, apples and oranges. Now, Ben, he's just a 14-year-old guy, comes to Canada trying to, wrestle with living in this place where there's, full of white people. He comes from Jamaica where, this is just such a culture shock for him. But he found some solace in the, little black and white TV they had in their apartment in the Downsview Park area. He fell in love with the majesty of the Olympic Games, and it kind of inspired him to, think about being the next Donald Quarry, some of those great sprinters from that era. So he saw it as a magical time and didn't see not winning a gold medal was a big deal because he's just a little boy, really. So, but anyway, what Canada did after that was starting to throw money, programming, and better coaching and like high performance centers at different sports, including track and field, as a way to like really sort of raise all boats very quickly. And as we found out down the road that, maybe they began to ignore a little bit of the information about Charlie's sprinters at the time when they're getting tips about these guys were doping, and some track and field officials just didn't want to hear it, but they just let it go because things were good. And, Charlie's kids were pulling in gold medals.
Yeah. And I have read Charlie Francis's book. I was fortunate enough to find it in a value village in Windsor, Ontario in 2020. And some of the way he described just the pushback he got when he first started working with his group of runners, and it was just like, oh my goodness, like I know, Canada's not this liberal oasis we like to think we are, but I was like, oh wow. So that sort of establishes Canada's motivation. And Mary, we were hoping you could read sort of a key passage. This is kind of, I guess, a moment of when they sort of decide, maybe I don't want to say a Breaking Bad moment because that's cliche, but this is late 1981. So they're early in the LA Olympic cycle. Ben is about to turn 20 years old, and he's got his first Commonwealth Games in a few months. Charlie Francis has just become a coach at the National Sprint Center in Toronto around this time. And and it's the mentor and the protege to have the talk.
Right. Okay, I'll read this. And at this point, too, I'll just say that Angela Isajenko, a fabulous, amazing woman who was one of the top sprinters in the world at that time, she was a bit of Charlie's guinea pig. She was already on the stuff. So that's where Charlie started to ask other people, do you want in on this? Because it's ridiculous. We're having to race against people who are on drugs and we're not. So anyway, here goes. All right. In Francis's opinion, the steroid advantage at the elite level represented about 1 meter or a full stride in the 100 meters. In running clean, Johnson was always going to be a meter behind his doping rivals. Years later, the coach would famously describe the steroid effect like this. Johnson could either put his starting blocks on the same line as his international competition or set them up a meter behind. Johnson said he wanted in. Like his coach, he didn't consider it cheating if his rivals were doping. I didn't see it as a problem for me to say yes or no to Charlie, he said, denying Francis pushed him into the steroid pool against his will. He believed that people were already breaking the rules and were not getting caught. We were trying to do it clean, and we were going to be in last place, so to speak. So I said, hey, if these guys are breaking the rules and I'm trying to do it clean, it doesn't make sense. Might as well join the club. Pat Reed, the former high jump coach who was on the same flights as Johnson out of Seoul, knew the sprinter and his coach well. He liked them. He also understood their dynamic, that Johnson was highly coachable and would unconditionally accept Francis's advice. Ben was an easy mark for Charlie to influence, Reed said. Others feel Johnson didn't need much of a shove. Tony Sharp, a former Optimist teammate and Olympic bronze medalist, who is now an award-winning certified sprint coach, said Francis didn't need to browbeat his runners about steroid enhancement. Like Johnson, Angela Isajenko, Desi Williams, and others, Sharp agreed to use steroids because they were so commonly taken across the elite competition landscape. There was this theory that you have to decide if you want to watch the finals or be in the finals, said Sharp. It was a culture influence more than a Charlie influence, though obviously he played a major role. The culture of the times, as Sharp points out, is important to what was happening in the Canadian sporting context. especially after the no gold embarrassment at the Montreal Games. Canada wanted Olympic medals. The government, through sports federations, was starting to throw money and support at sports and athletes who showed promise as world beaters. Track was one of those prize sports, with Francis's elite sprint group at the top of the heap. Francis became a paid coach in 1981. He was named coach of the National Sprint Center at York University and earned a $25,000 salary paid equally by Sport Canada and Sport Ontario. He would hold that top job through 1988. He remained convinced that to meet Sport Canada's goals of winning medals at major events, writing in his memoir, that steroids were an essential part of a world-class program.
Yeah, there it is. There's this sort of, I guess you'd call it permissiveness about it. Now in that era, when did Canadians sort of realize that, okay, well, there's something special here. We haven't looked under the hood necessarily, but they start to realize there's something special with Ben Johnson like we had not seen in, I guess, since probably maybe Harry Jerome briefly in the early 60s or Percy Williams in the 1920s.
I think that even though people back in the 1980s, I mean, we're talking about a long time ago. I mean, a lot of people knew what steroids were and kind of what doping was, but not everybody, including myself, not everybody was totally aware of what a steroid did to a body and how you used it and all these things. And the first time the IOC tested for steroids was at the 1976 Games and the Montreal Olympics. So, you know, there hadn't been a lot of positive tests for sprinters at that point. The people who were getting caught were weightlifters essentially, and maybe the odd shot putter, that type of thing. It was a time, and you're going to have to remind me, I just went down the wrong rabbit hole. What were you asking me?
Just sort of about just how Canada realized, okay, we have a star on our hands. And
right, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I was just
no, it's fine.
Back in the 80s, where I had, big shoulder pads and lots of hair. Well, you're correct. Nobody looked under the hood, and nobody wanted to ask a lot of questions because, Ben was a big international star before he became a Canadian star. Ben didn't become really, really special, I think, in the Canadian psyche until he won the 1987 World Championship in Rome, and that was in world record time. And when Canada realized, or Canadians realized, like, wow, this guy's a big deal, many other countries in the world were already watching his progress from 85, 86, 87. He began to catch up and then beat Carl Lewis over all those years. So, the country got behind him right around that time in Rome. And his international celebrity was huge. And then, of course, that was all amplified by his bitter rivalry with American Carl Lewis. They did not like each other. Carl Lewis said a lot of, rotten things about Ben, and Ben began to say rotten things about Carl, and people really couldn't get enough of this, enmity that was happening between two amateur athletes. It was something that was quite unprecedented, really.
Was that what caused Canadians to get so invested in it? Just the fact that it was easy to pick a guy and have opinions about whether he'll do it or whether he won't do it on the day that it matters?
Well, I think probably back then too, it just seems so long ago, but there weren't a lot of world champion Canadians in sports that were glamorous and that might lead to an Olympic gold medal. So we're still thinking about, gold medals. And Ben Johnson was, he was unique. He was just one of a kind. And I know we've had other fantastic athletes who'd won, Olympic events before, but this glamour race was something that everyone was able to focus on. And it was an event and a person that Canadians could really, get to know. And it captured the imagination of people beyond sports. I mean, when you start to drag in, sort of fringe sports fans and get them excited about track and field, I mean, that really says something about your your appeal to a lot of people around the planet.
And that brings to mind, I've always wondered too, I thought, 1988, I mean, there's outside things happening in the Olympics that year. They fell in between the Wayne Gretzky to LA trade and the free trade federal election. And I always wondered if, people had a little bit of anxiety, and it's like, oh, what are the Americans going to take from us now? But maybe that was just my kid brain overworking at the time.
No, I don't think so, but I think there is something there, and maybe it doesn't speak well of us as Canadians, but to be able to even symbolically, reach out and give Americans a little slap in the face and say, haha, we're, we can, our best guy beats your best guy all the time now. That was an enjoyable moment for a lot of Canadians, and they did enjoy that rivalry because, like, Ben was such a quiet, and still is, understated, quiet guy. Just sort of goes about his business. And back then, Carl Lewis was doing music videos and wearing, funny Beverly Hills Cop type of clothes in these videos, and trying to be an actor and trying to be an Olympian and all these things. So, he was kind of out there in a different kind of world, and Ben was just like all business.
Yeah, with Carl Lewis, and I still can't say the name without gnashing my teeth. It's been, most of my lifetime, but how fair is it to say he was the classic, he follows that archetype of the villain who thinks he's the hero. There's a little bit, I always think he's a little bit like Tom Brady. He doesn't understand that, nobody likes you.
Well, his parents liked him, come on.
I need to see evidence now. I'm just kidding.
He wasn't universally loved as maybe some other athletes had been in the past for the United States. And maybe because he was a bit more difficult to understand. I know there was a great, huge, long Sports Illustrated piece that ran on him before the 1984 games by Gary Smith, who's an excellent writer. And Carl Lewis hated that story. It's worth reading if anyone can find it. It's long, but it really does sort of delve into a lot of areas of Carl Lewis, even as a young guy. And Lewis was very upset by that story leading into the LA games.
Yeah, I'll have to find that. Of course, Gary Smith, one of the King's royalty for long form. You think of that story, Shadow of a Nation. I think is the one that was always shown in journalism class. Now, when we're getting to, I'm glad we've gotten to this point, because I think when the whole saga when the U.S. media picks up on it, it's always kind of like Ben, being in the way of Carl. But this shows, there's two people and two rivals, and neither of them is perfect, but they're very different. Now, explain the chapter in the book that talks about who was Andre Jackson and how did he manage to get into the doping control area when Ben is supposed to be producing his urine sample.
Right.
That's something.
Yeah, it is. It's a crazy story, and I'm still not sure what to think of it. But briefly, when Ben went into the doping control in Seoul, there was an American man sitting on the floor in the room where Ben was, and he really shouldn't have been there because Ben was supposed to go in with just one person. He couldn't even bring Charlie in with him. So Ben brought in his massage therapist because he was going to get ready for the 4x1 relay, which was later in the week, and Ben had a wonky Achilles tendon. So, he was getting some treatment on that. So this man on the floor was just sitting there talking to Ben, and Ben didn't ask who he was and couldn't remember that he'd actually met him years ago. But it was just elated with what he had done. He had a world record, and he had an Olympic medal, and he was pounding back 6, 7, 8 beers at the time because he was having trouble providing a urine sample. So this man is in the room. When Ben tested positive, the Olympic officials were asking, is there anything you can think of that we should know about, and he said, well, there was this guy in the room. I don't know his name. I didn't ask. Maybe he put some steroid pills in my beer because this guy was handing him beers. This man we came to know was an American named Andre Jackson. And Andre Jackson was a friend of Carl Lewis, a part of Carl Lewis's entourage, and was a track fan. And, that theory was debunked at the Dublin Inquiry, which was the Royal Commission that was, formed to examine what happened in Seoul. But that whole theory was debunked. Nobody spiked your beer. You just got caught. But years on, Ben and Andre connected. They've actually spoken to each other, and Ben's still hoping that Andre might actually tell him the truth about what happened. And Andre says, I'm just a friend of Ben's. And what got me interested in this whole affair was there was a great documentary called 979 by an English filmmaker, Dan Gordon. And there are a couple of bits of information that in that documentary that ran around 2012 or so, 2013, that I didn't know. Carl Lewis's manager, and a guy by the name of Joe Douglas, he says in the documentary that they, as a group, kind of snuck Andre Jackson into the doping control with a pass. And his job was to keep an eye on Ben Johnson to make sure he didn't mask his urine sample or, use somebody else's urine or not pull any funny business with his urine sample. And he was in there to take a photograph if anything like that happened. So that was one thing. I thought, wow, so that's an admission that the Carl Lewis camp actually put somebody in there to spy on Ben when he shouldn't have been in there. And then the other part of that was in that documentary, Dan Gordon had, connected with Andre Jackson and asked him, were you up to any shenanigans in that doping control? And the written response was, well, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. So that's where I got more involved in saying, what happened in that room? Why was he there? And his response to me was he was there properly. He had a pass on, and he didn't have a pass on, but he said it was to accompany an American 200-meter runner named Joe DeLoach. And that race was about 3 or 4 days in the future. So my take on this is Andre Jackson should not have been in there with Ben that day at that time.
Now, would that have been if Canada had really pressed on it? And I do remember reading, in the papers, there was an unauthorized man in the room. They just didn't know the name at the time. Could Canada have pressed on that and said, "Okay, this is, figuratively speaking, a mistrial"?
That was the basis of Ben's defense in Seoul, as mounted by Richard Pound. As I said, Richard Pound chose not to look at the science, which is I still find that amazing. But anyway, they focused on sabotage. Some guy in the room threw pills in Ben's beer, and that's kind of all they focused on. And of course, nobody bought that, and that just went out the window. And even at the Dublin inquiry, like I said, it got the short shrift. Nobody really thought it was anything. It was just grasping at straws, and a bit of a red herring, if nothing else. I mean, to this day, Ben still thinks Jackson was up to some funny business in the room. Me, I stopped short of that. I just don't know. I could never prove it. I don't know, and I'm just not sure that was ever the case.
And now, in terms of understanding the times that this all was taking place in, and explaining it to you, say, people your children's age, or me explaining it to someone born in 1990, how much of a factor too was, I guess, just the financialization that was taking place in the Olympics? Because it went from being, you're amateur, you can't have any money, and now all of a sudden Ben was pulling down $450,000 a month. And as you describe it, his third car was a champagne-colored Corvette.
Yeah. Well, Ben made millions, and he lost millions after that. And I'm sure Carl Lewis made millions, and other people. There was a lot of money on the line, and it came from shoe sponsors and clothing and other deals that you could have. Ben was sponsored by Mazda, a Japanese car maker. I think Fuji, lots of people. I think Amex. I think he was doing some stuff for Amex. So there were a lot of people coming to both of those guys, but Ben was starting to pull away because he was a world champion and world record holder. All these things that go into your contract, but pump up your bonus money and all that. So Ben probably conservatively lost about $10 to $20 million by testing positive in Seoul because everybody abandoned him, and the gravy train that he was on, it just stopped. I know it seems like maybe that's not big money compared to today, but it was a lot of money back then, and only a few people were really cashing in at that level. And Ben and Carl, and then some of the women too. Florence Griffith Joyner probably was up in that rarefied air as well. There were others.
Yeah, and this is just 15 years after, I think back, the movie they made about Steve Prefontaine, where he's played by Billy Crudup, and he's like, hey, I'm like surviving on government assistance to try to be competitive. But that was the reality of a Canadian or an American athlete.
Right.
Mary,
And don't forget, I'm sorry, don't forget too that
no, go on.
That when Ben made money, he was raising all boats, not just people in his entourage too, but the Canadian Track and Field Association, as it was called back then, was able to make some money off of Ben's fame as well by getting more sponsors and people to sponsor certain races and all that too. So the federation itself was able to catch a little of that stardust as well and put some money in the bank account.
And I actually wanted to ask, like, the important women in Ben's life, like mom, sister, aunt, how did they, contribute to him being just the resilient person who could survive all this? Because it wasn't like he was just like, it was vicious, the backlash and the mob mentality that ensued after the positive test.
Yeah. His mother, Gloria, who is now passed away, but she was a very strong Christian woman, very spiritual person, and tough as nails. I mean, she came to Canada before she brought the kids up. So she was working in Toronto for a couple of years trying to make some money to be able to bring all her children to Canada. And in Jamaica, she'd never worked outside the home. So she was tough. And she did that because she knew this was a place where her kids could get a better life or there are more opportunities for them rather than, back home in Jamaica. But Ben was devoted to her. He was her last son. And he almost died in infancy because I think malaria had swept through the town of Falmouth, and he was very, very ill as a baby. And when he pulled through, she thought he was her miracle child. He felt he was the man of the house too, because his dad stayed in Jamaica, Ben Sr. I mean, it's just the way their household worked. He was looking after some property in Jamaica. He was going to stay there and just come to visit. So she was looking after everybody here. But, he would watch her as a boy in high school. She'd take 3 buses to go to her job at a cafeteria and at a hotel near the airport, come home at midnight or whatever. And he said, one day I'm going to make it up to you, Mom. We're going to, do this together, and I'm going to win for you. And he said to me many, many times, winning that race in Seoul was for his mother. That was the only person he cared about. And that was what drove him. And, he was just absolutely at her side at all times.
And at the same time there, I love the observation you had about after this shock news is delivered to him, but his mom, like I think you said something, she didn't judge him at all. And how valuable do you think that is to, a young adult that your parent, at the worst moment in their life, that your parent is still there for you?
I agree. She didn't say, oh my God, how could you have done something so stupid? She just said, it's going to be okay. And he's, looking at the ceiling, and she's just stroking his brow saying it's going to be okay. Because at that point, she may have suspected he was using something, but he'd never told her. So he had to, sort of fess up at that point. And so she was not judgmental, and he needed her because, this was pre-internet and everything, obviously 1988, sort of like pre-cell phone. And he was still, like I would say, totally traumatized. And so this world shaming that went on, that came as he was like fleeing Seoul under this whole cloak of disgrace. It was a lot for a young guy. I know he was 26 at the time, but I mean, what athletes are like. They live in this sort of bubble life where the entourage looks after everything, takes care of troubles, and, does your banking and go get you food, all this stuff. That was happening for Ben too. And suddenly he was stripped of all that. everybody scattered and lawyered up because they knew something was going to come down the pike that wasn't very pleasant. And Ben was alone. He's trapped like a zoo animal with his family stuck in his house in Scarborough, and they couldn't go anywhere. And I think his mom and his sisters and brothers, the brother played a big role in just keeping him as calm as possible and just trying to, just weather the storm.
And that sort of brings me around to just what the aftermath of all that for Canadians, I guess. First off, for yourself, you were in Seoul covering it for the Star. How did Canadian journalists? I think Charles Pierce wrote an essay in 2012 saying, he saw the Canadian reporters that morning, and I don't know if you would have been one of them, Mary. But he's like they looked like hell's breakfast buffet. How did anyone manage to go on? That his phrase, not mine. Again, how did anyone manage to go on and actually finish their assignment? Because there was still another 10 days or so there. And so
I will tell you because we got called like at 4:30 in the morning to go. This news just broke. They get a call from Toronto. Go find this guy. This just happened. We're like, what? And of course, by the time we all sort of run out, like with yesterday's clothes on and looking terrible, and they didn't know where to go. He was long gone. Like he was gone. So there's all this crazy news going on, and it was kind of like shameful. It's like, how could you guys not know this guy was on drugs? And the answer is like, well, I don't know. Like, I didn't know I had no idea he hadn't failed the test. And then it was just like, having to finish the Olympics was just the longest assignment of my life. We were all kind of like wearing it as Canadians, not just because of what Ben had done, but because we had done pretty crappy jobs as journalists trying to look into this. What was going on was, is it the whole group? And then, it was not a lot of fun. And I think there was a lot of probably navel gazing at that point as Canadian journalists, because other international journalists are asking us, well, didn't you guys ask them about any of this stuff? Like, didn't you, investigate anything? And the answer was kind of like, well, no, they told us they were using vitamin B12, and we just bought it. So it was kind of embarrassing.
And the reaction back home, I mean, I remember being, just as a kid, kind of being frightened. I mean, like I say, I was 11, 12 years old when that, the Dublin inquiry, I was just like, how could people just turn on this guy so fast and, just believe so many things that were put out there about him, including, and that was just from some of the people trying to, get on Team Ben, so to speak. But I sort of wanted to ask, how did you sort of make that make sense in the narrative? Because when I sort of read through it a couple of times, I felt like, wow, I'm like almost in like this Guy Ritchie or Quentin Tarantino movie where the long con is falling apart and the people are in scramble mode, and this is where the stress-induced mistakes start to happen. How did you manage to keep all that, make sense of just that bedlam as a writer?
In the book, you mean? I actually did rely. I did rely quite a bit on Ben, obviously, but Charlie Francis wrote that book, Speed Trap, in 1990, and it was a pretty good and gripping account that probably didn't get enough attention at the time as a book, because everyone had just dismissed these guys as total cheaters and losers and irredeemable human beings. And Angela Izajenko also wrote a book that was very raw and candid called Running Risks around the same time, 1990, a little bit different. So I was able to, make sense of how they remembered the time, looked at a lot of archival information in our newspapers and CBC and some, international reporting as well, and from Ben alone. But it was just this mad scramble. And then when the government gets involved too, they play quite a big role in, sort of defining Ben for all time, whether they, meant to do that or not. But by, when the news of Ben breaks, and then the Canadian government comes out and announces to the whole country that Ben Johnson, the guy you were just, celebrating and venerating a couple of days ago, is now banned for life, can't compete for Canada ever again. He's a very bad guy. That went right to the core of a lot of people who just trying to make sense of it themselves. So I was hoping to try to catch some of that in the book and try to, because, people have fallen from great heights since, like including like a Lance Armstrong. But Ben's enormity was because he was one of the biggest stars on the planet. Not just a sports star. He was really well known all over the place, like a guy like a Maradona. They were kind of like confreres around that same era. So, with Ben falling and people just trying to, think, well, you cheated on top of everything else, and we didn't expect that. So I just don't know if it hits, if it happened today, let's put it this way, if it happened today and Ben tested positive today in 2024 for something, people would just go, oh, that's unfortunate. He's just going to join another long list of famous guys who failed drug tests. But back then, it was cataclysmic.
Yeah, he was the first track and field Olympian to lose their medal, and I think this line in Moneyball is the first one through the door gets bloody. But
that's right. And first of that stature, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in 2023, I guess would have been just before you handed in the book, you and Ben Johnson, you spent a day in Napanee, Ontario, my birthplace, with Bobby Kettlewell, an artist, and the artwork of Ben that she was actually commissioned to create. What did that bring home about just how Canadians did venerate him until he got caught?
Well, it was amazing. I saw a photograph of her in newspaper archives, and there's a little cut line about her doing the statue of Ben Johnson. And I went, what is that? And that's the thing that all got lost in the time, right? So she had entered a contest to be commissioned to do something on Ben after Rome. Like, he was huge news. So it was going to be in the Ontario Science Centre and then move up to Ottawa. And it was going to be him running in 4 stages of his race, the life-size statues of Ben. And within days of his positive test, the project was just ended, just crushed. But she'd already made smaller versions of each of the life-size statues called maquettes that she was able to eventually later on get hold of and had them bronzed. So, when we actually went out to see her, and she was gracious enough to let us come out and visit her, it was a very moving time for her too, because she said that this amazing project and this incredible person that she'd worked very hard with to get all his anatomical, muscles and hair and feet and shoes and all that together, it just died, like just immediately, as if he didn't even exist, So they had an emotional meeting in Napanee, and Ben sat in her studio and they talked about it, and he held these very heavy little, bronze maquettes, and he just loved them. And it was almost like stepping back in time, because she obviously moved on with her life. She was still an artist, but she was, she'd gone on to move into the sciences, and because she was affected by it very badly, and people were mean to her. How could you possibly, be involved in this project? But it was great to see them come together at the end. And they, again, as I say in the book, she said it was her best work, and it was him captured in bronze at his zenith, at his peak of athletic fitness. So it was kind of interesting to watch those two interact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the artist with the portrait of the athlete. And in terms of another genre that I'm a big fan of, there's that saying, of course, all comedy begins as tragedy. We've been going through some, serious subject matter. I was blown away when you write in the book that there's actually a series about Ben Johnson's life and development, but it's headed by a writer from this show called The Office. I might have mentioned it on here once or twice. How does that sort of land with you as an investigative journalist, seeing the comedy world, put a twist on it?
Well, when they first said, this was New Metric Media, they said, we've got this idea to do a series on Ben. We're going to, try to tell his truth and, stick to the story as closely as we can. But we're going to make it funny. I went, oh, okay. All right. Sounds weird. But if, did you see Winning Time with the Lakers?
Yes, I watched it religiously. Yes.
Yeah, I ran to the TV every Sunday. I didn't want to miss a minute of that series. I loved it so much. So I could see how sometimes when you use comedy to tell a difficult story, it can be very powerful. So that's all I know about that. But like I said, I thought, well, yeah, that could work, because there's so many like crazy characters involved in Ben's life, around him. Like there's all kinds of people in his orbit that are just kind of wild and kooky, but we're along for the ride. So you could have a little bit of fun with that while still telling a truthful story.
Yeah, just imagining, like, when you mentioned Diego Maradona, the great Argentina's great soccer hero, and he's passed now. I was like, at that stage in 1997, the only human being in the world that probably could have understood Maradona was Ben Johnson, and vice versa. I think it's not inaccurate for an outsider such as myself to say.
Yeah.
Now, just sort of wind down. What's the importance of a role a publisher like Sutherland House has to get, really a story about Canadian, sports and, social history, getting it to market, because it's definitely a niche that needs to be filled.
That's a great question, because when Ben asked me to do his book, of course, like I said, I didn't have any experience in this publishing world at all, and I did ask, several people, agents, would you be interested in helping me? And the answer I got, all of them was very nice, but they all said, oh, we all know the Ben Johnson story, like nobody cares. That's old stuff. And I went, well, actually, you don't know, because soul was a big part of it. And then, and then there's this other afterlife, like he fails a second test, and then there's Maradona, and then there's Muammar Gaddafi's kid, and then the Mounties are after him, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's like wild. And they go, nah, I don't think so. So it was a hard sell. But then I had a friend, Paul Woods, who worked at the Toronto Star, and he'd written a book about the Wayne Gretzky, Bruce McNall, John Candy Argos, called Year of the Rocket. And that was published by Sutherland House, a small indie publishing firm run by Ken White. And Paul was the one who connected me with Ken, because I said, oh, nobody's interested in this. I don't think it's going to go. And boo-hoo-hoo. There's my chance to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
It's all gone. But Ken said, well, tell me about Ben Johnson. And then he would, I'd read that book. So I think that, because one guy said, or two guys, actually, Paul and Ken said, I think that's an important historical book. I like the way you're going to take investigation into his story. And it's not a memoir. It's a bit of a biography. It's also a cold case. So let's look at something and let's tell people what's new. And we'll remind them of things we forgot. So that role of a Canadian publisher is priceless in this case of Ben Johnson, because I don't think anybody else would have touched the story, but a small Canadian publisher said, yeah, let's do that book. So I'm so grateful to them.
Now, is it helpful at all? I mean, it was a different publisher, but Donovan Bailey also brought out a book last year. We had Donovan on here to talk about it. How much does it sort of help that both of them have their stories out here in an Olympic year, just for, I guess, generating interest and reminding Canadians, well, we've got Andre DeGrasse too as well, and we've had others, but we've kind of got this unique history in men's sprinting.
Well, we do, and I'm glad you mentioned that too. And I read Donovan's book, and I thought, it's a memoir. He's a smart guy, and it was really interesting, right? So he's got his story. Andre's was a little bit different, and I must say, it's wonderful that we're looking at different athletes in Canada as opposed to any guy who's ever played in the NHL. Now, I love hockey. My kids all played hockey. Mm-hmm. But, we were really inundated with a lot of hockey books.
Yeah.
In series like 1972 that they just keep writing about these same things. So I think it's wonderful that Canadians have a chance to read something a little different, understand the history, and understand the history from different athletes and a different perspective. It's not everybody who grew up in the Toronto area and played minor hockey. These guys led a different life, and it's fascinating reading, and we should all be able to learn from this.
Yeah, and of course, segueing with different athletes, different history. You were, before you were a writer, you were a very good, all Big Ten team co-captain, volleyball player at. Well, I'm a Michigan fan, but I will say for Ohio State. I'm allowed to. I have to say once.
Okay.
But I just wanted to sort of ask. That was early Title IX era.
Yeah.
How does your generation of athlete look at everything that's going on now with this boom in women's
Oh,
sports? Caitlin Clark's going to get her own shoe. The NCAA
yeah.
women's title basketball game more membership than the men. Nebraska volleyball game in the football stadium. We got, I think, 92,000 people. That's just in the last 12 months.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. Like we felt
why did this not happen sooner? But I was interested to hear.
we were of that era. We felt very, very fortunate to be there in the 70s because, Title IX had, kicked in, and we felt pretty special because we had, nice uniforms, we got to travel, and a beautiful program, and had nice facilities, but nobody really showed up to watch us. The parents, and there was a TV deal was like, you got to be kidding me. But over the decades, all this hard work that's gone in, and the promotion of women as real athletes as opposed to just the female side of things, and we've got to even up the numbers for the Title IX rules. So that's why they're here. They've proven themselves, and I think even going back to like some of those track athletes in the 80s, like Florence Griffith Joyner and Jackie Joyner Kersee, the big American stars. And then later on, Marion Jones got into some trouble, but she was a good basketball player as well. And then, coming into the WNBA, the early stages of that, pushing. But to see what they've come, how far women have come now, it's stunning, and they deserve it. And it's a lot of hard work. And I think one of the most important things about producing athletes that can be at this level and, cash these big checks coming from shoe companies and stuff, good coaching has come along the way as well. That's as important as money for some athletes. The coaching is part of infrastructure that can raise not just the stars that come out in these programs, but they're other girls as well. So and it's not just male coaches anymore. Now we're seeing a lot of female coaches coming through a lot of the sports and saying this is a profession for me now. It doesn't have to be a volunteer thing. I can make money as a coach as well. So to see the world coming this way is phenomenal. And I never thought that would happen, like back when I was playing. But my own daughter plays down at San Diego State University, plays lacrosse down there. So even in our own life, things have come a bit full circle. So, girls my age having girls, playing sports now too. So it's kind of very cool.
Yeah, I never touched a lacrosse stick growing up, and I'm imagining that wasn't, even though lacrosse is fairly popular through Southern Ontario, I'm imagining that might have been the case on your end too, I think, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a niche sport in some ways, for women, but it's, I never played lacrosse growing up, but, she caught the bug and loved it.
And just sort of one, maybe couple to wind down. And Mary, we're, super, on behalf of Neil and myself, we're super appreciative of all the time you've given us tonight.
Oh, this is great. Are you kidding? I am so grateful and thankful. Please. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Just after, everything you've, gone in, covered in this book and what you've seen in your own career, how does when the Olympics do roll around, because there is one this summer, I think what kind of feelings sort of come up for you, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I can't help myself. I have to watch every minute. I got to tell you, even though, a bit of a cynical eye, obviously, for certain events and certain sports, but I am glued to the TV and I'm excited by it because maybe one of the great things that goes unsaid is, a lot of the athletes out there do compete clean. And I think you have to give, that credit to that part of the Olympic movement. There are a lot of kids out there who don't cheat at all. But beyond that, I can't help myself. It's just the most amazing time. I don't know about you, but I don't want to miss any of it.
No, I don't either. I think it was because we had a COVID games in 2021 and called it Tokyo 2020. I realized, I do need this in my life. Yeah. Someday I'll tell the story that was also the Olympics that gave me my worst betting beat ever, actually. If you want to hear the story, I don't know.
I do.
Oh, well, no, I have Swedish heritage, so I had actually, at the start of the women's soccer tournament, I was like, the odds on Sweden look pretty good here. And their captain has the same last name as me, said the same, spelt differently. And who's the one who puts the potential winning penalty in the gold medal game off the bar? Carolyn Sager. And of course, Canada wins. So I was just like, I'm on $100, but, way to go, gold medals.
Yeah.
And Mary, just, what else do you have, as we wrap up here, what else do you have coming up?
Nothing. I'm a big fat bore now.
Oh, perfect. Well, we'll end there. For our guests, of course, sportslit.ca, our whole archive, links to buy the books, and the episodes are wherever you find the podcast. Thank you so much to Mary Ormsby, author of World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson, which was released April 16th, 2024 by Sutherland House.
Thank you, Nate.
And you're welcome.